Okay, first of all, I want to welcome the people who are here and who will have to leave in an hour to listen to another video conference in another room. I will make a pause before 11 o'clock so that we can make the transition and everybody will be comfortable and we won't have a disturbance. Although with revenge, disturbances are a normal thing, so we should be happy for them. I welcome all the rest who have had the courage to come back for a second lecture. And I will begin as usual. The lecture is posted on the board so you can read and follow. I hope people at the very back have good eyes so that you can. You also, if you are participating, should have a copy of it sent to you in advance. Everyone, if you haven't do that already, you can register for them. And all of the talks will be distributed before the lecture. So you can have them in your hand, you can follow them while I read, or you can read them in advance if you like, or afterwards, if there's something that you missed and feel you want. Now, last week, actually it's 2 weeks ago, we looked at acts of extreme revenge in the Homeric epics. And we considered how revenge was regarded in a wider social context. That was last week. But we did not pay equal attention to the state of mind of the avenger. What motivated him or her, and there are women avengers, as we will see later, what motivated them to take revenge? Was it a passion for fairness? In other words, he did something for me and I will get back, it's only fair? To what extent was honor, injured honor, a motive? Achilles could not be appeased even by mutilating the body of his fallen enemy, Hector. Is true vengeance even possible? That would be a question we could ask. Today, we will consider the subjective side of revenge, and more particularly, the emotions that drive people to avenge themselves on others, often even without regard to their own welfare. In other words, you can take vengeance even if you will come out worse. For revenge does not seem like an emotional passion affecting not just the mind, does seem, like an emotional passion affecting not the mind only, but the whole body. And yet, there also seem to be cold-blooded acts of vengeance, slow and calculating, a notion encapsulated in the phrase I wrote here, attributed to it, actually is by the French writer Guy de Maupassant: revenge is a dish best eaten cold. In other words, if you're going to take vengeance on someone, wait. Wait until the passion has dropped and you have time. Now, why would you want to wait? There are several reasons why. One of them might be, I want to wait to take vengeance so that the other person is worried for a long time, is nervous, is scared. In other words, yes, we eat it cold, but its purpose is to increase the harm done to the other person by the suspense of when vengeance will be taken. In any case, the question I will ask today, and let me just say this will occupy us further in later sessions. The question I'm going to ask today is there no difference between actions of revenge that are taken in these two different states of mind? When I am hot-passioned and eager to get revenge, and when I am cold and calculating. And if there is a difference between them, the more passionate variety, then what we want to ask is the more passionate kind the real revenge? And the other kind might be a kind of taking justice into your own hands. In which case, should we apply to that kind of retaliation the name retribution? Now, what I just want to alert you to, and today's lecture may go a little bit over time, or we may save some at the end for next time, but I want to go slowly. what I am looking at here is whether or not we should draw a distinction between revenge and retribution. And if we do, what kind of distinction should we draw? And more particularly, is it relevant to say that revenge is taken in the heat of passion, whereas retribution does not have to be? It's more a sense of making sure that justice is served. That's the kind of question that we're going to be looking at. And it has been much debated. Later on this morning, we will have examples of a very explicit challenge to the idea, the argument that there is no difference between revenge and retribution. And I will try to set out the reasons why we should think there is. And I'm going to begin, as you see on the screen, I'm going to begin with Aristotle, who I think can help shed some light on these questions. Let me move these things so that I'm keeping my phone here to check the time so I don't go over, okay? And particularly, I think Aristotle will help us to understand the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, in his treatise on rhetoric, Aristotle wrote an essay on rhetoric, which we still have. Aristotle devotes the opening part of the second book, 11 sections of the second book, to a study of the emotions. Emotion in Greek, that the term that Aristotle uses for the emotions is pathos, as in pathetic, pathology, and so on. The plural of pathos is pathe in Greek. Okay, so, and the first pathos that he deals with is anger. And he begins with a definition. Now, as always, I have to be very careful and say that Aristotle is not actually analyzing anger. He is analyzing orge. That's his word, which we translate as anger. But can we be sure that this is absolutely correct? Even in Portuguese, can we be sure that the English anger corresponds very perfectly to, for example, a raiva, or maybe better to ira, or maybe better to some other term? If I were speaking Spanish now, I would give you 45 words for anger. And the only thing I can say about the Spanish is they need them all. And some of you know my wife is Spanish. I have personal experience in this sphere. So let us look at the way that Aristotle describes anger. And it's all on the board here. I hope all of you can see it. Let anger, that's the way he describes it, be a desire accompanied by pain for a perceived revenge. That's what anger is. Let it be, he means, it's his way of giving a definition. Anger is a desire for a perceived revenge, we'll get back to that word, on account of a perceived slight. I'll tell you what a slight is in a moment, on the part of people who aren't fit to slight you or your own. That is to say, people who are near and dear to you. So anger is first and foremost a desire for revenge. That's what it is. It's not something else. As an emotion, it also has what modern psychologists call a valence, which is to say, in this case, it's a negative valence, meaning it's painful. Although Aristotle recognizes right afterwards that there is also pleasure associated in anger because we have fantasies of getting revenge. The cause of the desire is a slight or an insult. The word that Aristotle uses is oligoria. I wonder if any of you have heard, maybe in English, it's a technical term, oligopoly. Oligopoly is not a monopoly, which is when one company dominates everything, but when a few do. And oligos in Greek means a few. And ologia is when you make somebody less. That's exactly what the word means. And so it's an insult. It lowers your status. And modern accounts of revenge often stress, not always, the crucial role of prestige and reputation. Although there is a tendency to ascribe salience. What I mean by that is to say that this concern with status is very particularly associated with honor cultures. We make a distinction, and I'll just show you an example right away. Let me take an article, and then we'll talk about it a little more informally. 2 weeks ago, we talked about this article by Jackson, Choi, and Gelfand called Revenge, a Multi-Level Review and Synthesis. And here's what they write in their article. They're referring to a book called Virtuous Violence. And they write, I'm quoting, regions with cultures of honor, such as the American South, they mean the United States South, and the Middle East, tend to feature this kind of virtuous violence. In other words, you take violence, but it's a good thing, more than other regions of the world. In these areas, there is less stigma around retaliatory aggression, and certain forms of revenge are actually normatively encouraged. In other words, I'll pause for a moment to explain. There are parts of the world in which if you don't take revenge, you are less than a person, less honorable. You lose status. I haven't quoted it in this paper, but Aristotle says in the Ethics, he says, anger should be moderate. We're going to come in a moment to show an argument that there should be no anger at all, in just a moment. But not now. Right now, he says, you shouldn't have too much anger, but you also shouldn't be without anger. Somebody who cannot feel anger, Aristotle says, is like a slave. Because you have no honor if you're a slave. You cannot defend your honor, you have no honor, you're a thing. This is Aristotle's very explicit description. In any case, the writers now, I'm still quoting, go on, American Southern men can be the subject of disapproval and defamation if they do not defend their honor, while both men and women in the Middle East can easily lose their honor after they are publicly insulted or shamed. These different social norms explain many cross-cultural differences in revenge. If you were reading the Iliad with me 2 weeks ago, you'll see how easily this could apply to the case of Achilles, and we will come back to this very explicitly later. So a case can be made that honor, or at least a sense of social dignity, was a very important value in the ancient Greek city-state. And this would confirm the picture here. By the way, I don't want you to take this picture at face value. Sometimes, particularly descriptions of Middle Eastern society are based on certain kinds of prejudices. And we have to be very careful about a kind of colonialist projection onto these societies. But nevertheless, we don't want to go so far as to ignore social differences. What we perhaps want to do, and I will be doing this consistently here, is to take away the value judgment in making such differences. So let's continue. Note especially the final phrase in Aristotle's definition, which says that a slight is something that comes from somebody who is not fit to give you an insult. So that's very important. Why would you answer that? I mean, if I were to say today, anger is a desire for revenge for somebody who insults you, I probably wouldn't add, this is the case only if the person isn't fit to insult you. What does he mean by that? And I can give you the answer very easily. If you are a slave and your master speaks rudely to you, you don't get angry. And we saw last time why you don't get angry, because you can't get revenge. And anger is a desire for revenge, and if you know you can't get it, you can't feel it. Now, is it true that slaves felt no anger? Of course not. Is it true that masters of slaves thought that way? That's a different question. And we see it in Aristotle. There are times when somebody puts you down, and that person is in a sufficiently superior state that you don't take insult, you don't take umbrage at that. And Aristotle is extremely aware of it. So he brings this into his definition. It's not just an additional statement, it's part of the definition of anger. He goes on for anger quite a bit. So I wanted to maybe call even more attention to this than I did in the context of what I wrote out. So the author of the study that we just quoted, note further, and I'm quoting them again, cultures of honor tend to have histories of weak law enforcement. The reason that cultural evolutionists argue for revenge's function as a means of social control in the absence of strong policing. So not only is it characteristic of honor societies, but it's characteristic of honor societies where there isn't a strong institution of justice. So you have no choice but to take it into your own hands. And something similar could be said for ancient Greece, maybe for Homer's time, although in Athens there was a fairly developed judicial system and procedures that were precisely intended to avoid somebody taking vengeance into their own hands. The law did it for you. Does that mean that there was a strict separation between legal recourse and doing it yourself? Not so quickly. We will come back to this later. So let's return to Aristotle's definition. We all have a sense of what anger means. And we may suppose, if I were to ask you, that we could feel anger at many things that aren't a slight or even for no reason. Have you ever woken up in the morning and you're angry? As I told you, I'm married to a Spanish woman. So you get up in the morning, or you just, something irritating me. I don't even know what it is. You might feel anger, for example, when you stub your toe against the chair or against the table. It hurts. And I would say, I felt angry. I would imagine in Portuguese you say this too, right? I banged my knee against it. Oh, God, I'm so angry. Well, but this would be ridiculous to think that the chair has insulted you. So animals seem to feel anger. Your dog, your cat, they seem to be angry, but I don't think they are sensitive to insults in the same way that human beings are. Now, I know there are going to be pet lovers out here who think that they are absolutely. And when I say bad dog, he knows exactly what I mean, and he has a moral reaction. But, you know, if I go up to a cow, and even if I could speak cow language, and I said, you know, the other cow is more beautiful, they don't get angry for this. We have to wonder whether they even had the concept. So in defining anger as a desire for revenge, and specifically in response to slights put down, Aristotle isn't describing anger in all the ways we might use the word in normal discourse. Rather, he is abstracting from experience. This is what scientists do all the time. You abstract from experience, and he stipulates a definition in which all the terms are related. And here is a point I'm going to make that is, I'm not so sure about anymore. And I'm going to make it anyway, but we'll come back to it. If I take anger is a desire for revenge, can I turn that around and say revenge is exactly what anger tries to achieve? It's not so obvious. I thought once upon a time I could make it work. And I'll ask for your help, because we're going to come back to this. We have 6 more lectures, and we're going into much more modern things later on, and we will today too. But modern case studies and examples of violence and efforts at reconciliation and on many levels, international, trauma victims, and so on. But I wonder if some of you know the formula that force is equal to mass over acceleration. F equals m over a. Force, or Einstein's formula. The speed of light equals mc squared. You know, E equals mc squared. When you write a formula like that, force equals mass over acceleration, every element in that equation is defined in relation to every other element. So mass equals force times acceleration. Acceleration equals mass times this. This is, in other words, once you have the equation, it's not just defining force equals mass over acceleration. It's also defining mass and acceleration. It's a structure that defines everything. And so I'm asking, if Aristotle says anger is the desire for revenge, can I say revenge is and only is what anger desires? That would be using Aristotle's expression in this way. And so what we get is a more complicated picture. We get here that, and here I continue where I was writing, that revenge, we could think of in ordinary life, and there are many things that might cause it, including a dispassionate kind of reckoning, just without energy in it, without motion. But, and we could call these all retribution, and we could say that everybody wants to get even. But I'm claiming that in Aristotle, revenge is retribution that is motivated by anger. That's what revenge is. Anger is not only one motive, or it doesn't attend it, it doesn't predict revenge. Anger is constitutive of revenge. On Aristotle's definition, and as I'm interpreting it, revenge is retribution motivated by anger and nothing else. Now, I have used the terms revenge and retribution to distinguish between a technical sense, which I derive from Aristotle, and a more general notion of requital. I just get back. Aristotle's own words, however, the word for revenge, timoria, can mean both punishment and revenge. So I will look at these concepts more closely in a moment, but before we get to it, I want to look at an account of retribution. I'm now separating it out from revenge. I want to look at an account of retribution that is completely separates retribution from anger. And it's an ancient one. I'm referring to the Stoic view, which is most clearly represented in a treatise by the philosopher Seneca called On Anger. Let me just tell you, Seneca lived in the 1st century AD. He was the tutor of the Emperor Nero until Nero grew up and felt he didn't want a Stoic looking over him all the time, and he gave orders for Seneca to kill himself. And when we saw this last time, remember, we were looking at, I said, when a king tells you to kill yourself, it's a good idea. Because if you don't, what he will do to you is worse. So this is the theory behind it. Now, what does Seneca say? He says, we Stoics define anger just the way Aristotle does. Aristotle's definition is not far from ours, he says. And then he explains, there is no doubt but that what arouses anger is the impression that is presented to us of an injury or an insult. So I feel insulted, and that's what gets my anger going. He uses the term inuria rather than algoria, but it's okay. That's not very different. And I have a technical thing going back to the founder of the Stoic school, that anger is the desire to take vengeance against someone who is believed to have committed a wrong contrary to what you deserve. And Aristotle also does say that an injustice can feel like an insult. So we can look at all that. But the Stoics maintained further that anger, like all emotions, is a voluntary reaction, and it differs from responses that are not subject to the will, and so are invincible. So what he means by that, what the Stoics mean by that is there are some things that are automatic. And they give a bunch of funny examples. I'll just give you two now. One of them is if somebody pours cold water on you, you get goosebumps. You know what I mean by, I forgot, what are they called in Portuguese? The little pimples that come on when you get very cold all of a sudden, you come out of the shower. Yeah, so, okay. Also, if somebody gets you very frightened, your hair could stand up. Not mine, but yours. So, but then he says, Seneca says, this is also true when we watch a movie. He doesn't say a movie, he says a play. Or we read a story, and it produces horror or fear or pity. He says those are not real emotions. They're just instinctive reactions. Now, why would he say that? We're in the theater, and because you're in the theater, and you feel fear, but you don't run away. You feel pity, but you don't try to help the person on the screen. So these aren't real emotions. They're pseudo-emotions. They are aesthetic emotions. They're natural. Color, when you're frightened, is natural color change, but it's not an emotion because it's involuntary. Emotions for the Stoics are involuntary. Now, if anger is, and Seneca held and Chrysippus, the desire to take vengeance, as Aristotle said, what happens to vengeance when you eliminate anger? In accord with the Stoic ideal of apatheia, no pathe, no pathos. The Stoics believe that you should never feel anger. If you can never feel anger, and revenge is what anger desires, how can you want revenge? Seneca says, anger is not only harmful and inspires extremes of human cruelty, it's useless in any context, even in war. No matter what happens, including, he says, the murder of your own father, it is wrong to feel angry. He says you will want justice, and you may attempt to protect them, but if I do, and I'm about to quote Seneca at some length, so let me stop for a moment. Somebody has harmed my own parent. And in Greek and Roman thought, harm to your parents, the father, is the worst kind of thing. Have any of you ever heard the paradoxical statement, somebody asks you a question, have you stopped beating your wife? And answer yes or no. Have you stopped beating your wife? If I say yes, it means I used to beat her and I don't beat her anymore. If I say no, it means I'm still beating my wife. So if you have to answer yes or no, you're in trouble either way. That goes back to the Greeks, except that in Greek, have you stopped beating your father? Fathers are crucial in this. So what does Seneca say? What? Is a good man not to be angry if he sees his father murdered or his mother violated? That's the question. No, he will not be angry, but he will avenge and protect them. Why do you fear that filial piety, devotion to your parents, will not prove a sufficient spur, a sufficient motive to a person even without anger? So somebody harms a dear person to you. Is the only reason for getting even, is the only reason for retaliating anger? Isn't it enough to feel that person did wrong? Isn't it enough to feel that the love for the person in question is motive enough, or respect? The good man will do his duty, officia, his office, without disturbance or fear. And he will do what is worthy of a good man, so as to do nothing unworthy. My father will be murdered, I will defend him. He has been murdered, I will follow it up, not because I'm feeling grief, that's a passion, but because I ought to. To feel anger on behalf of a dear person is not the sign of a dutiful person, but of an infirm mind. So, somebody has hurt my father. It is my duty to protect my father and to get revenge. I don't need anger. And in fact, if I am angry, it's going to be the worst kind of thing. It will have many effects. It could, for example, make me behave in a way that is irrational and suddenly I lose my objective. I had be much better off being cool and collected. It will be practical, and it will also keep me from doing anything unjust, anything excessive. The emotions, the normal emotions in Stoic thought are useless, and worse than that, they are damaging. And a Stoic wise person will not feel those emotions. I should tell you that there are emotions that the Stoics did allow. They were called good pathe, and they were different from the regular emotions. There was no anger. But, for example, what about fear? The real Stoic won't feel fear, but he will be cautious. You're careful. And that's a good feeling, or an approved feeling. So, you may be moved by duty or devotion or respect for the law to see to it that the offender is justly punished. But this is to seek, and I'm claiming, retribution, not revenge. Revenge is, as both Aristotle and Seneca agree, motivated by anger, which has vengeance as its proper objective. Eliminate the passion, and you have done away with revenge itself. Check all the time. Okay, another few minutes and we'll make a pause. Now, Aristotle also seems to have distinguished the cool and calculating intention to repay evil with evil, which he ascribes to the old people, from anger proper. When he speaks of old people, he says that their reactions are feeble, they're weak. I quote, their outbursts of anger are violent but weak, and of their desires some have ceased, while others are feeble, so that they don't feel them and they don't act in accordance with them, but only from motives of gain. And according to Aristotle, the older we get, the more interested we are in money. And it substitutes for all the other passions, which we have slowly lost. I'm not sure I fully agree with Aristotle on this point, but let's just say here, if revenge is just what anger aims at, then we may understand something about revenge by examining the phenomenology of anger. You see the way I'm reasoning here? If anger is so central to revenge, let's look at what anger is like, and then we may understand revenge better. For example, one stipulation in Aristotle's definition of anger that I have neglected so far is that the vengeance to which anger aspires must be perceived. The Greek word is phenomenos. It comes from the same root as phenomenology and phenomenon. Now, there's some debate among scholars about what Aristotle means when he says anger, revenge must be perceived. Some say it should be strong, so it's perceptible. Others, the most famous English language British critic of Aristotle, who translated all of Aristotle, Sir David Ross, decided that that word should be deleted. It doesn't belong. You know, textual critics, they say, first of all, they interpret, then they say, well, let's get rid of this because it doesn't fit my theory. I wanted to fit the theory, and I took it from Aristotle's description of hatred. And here, let me show you what Aristotle says about hatred. Anger derives from what happens to you, whereas enmity or hostility arises also even if the offense is not directed to you. So, give you an example. Somebody insults another person, not a friend of yours. That's too close. That's like you. You see a person insulting someone because of their age, their gender, their race, something else. And you dislike that person. And you would really like to get rid of that person. People like that. He says, for if we believe someone is of a certain kind of person, deeply prejudiced, we hate the person. It doesn't have to happen to me. I'm not angry, but I really dislike the person, according to Aristotle. Also, anger is always about individuals, whereas hatred is felt toward types. He says a thief or an informer. So I could say a prejudiced person. I really dislike prejudiced people. I'm not angry. I just dislike them. I think what they're doing is totally wrong, and I want to get rid of them. So he says, also, for the one, and this is anger, I want to hurt the other person. Whereas, whereas the other one, I just want to inflict harm. For he says, when I am angry, I want to see the consequences of my revenge. But if I am hating someone, I don't care. Now let me again, this is so tight what Aristotle says, so we have to open it up a little bit. Somebody has insulted me publicly. I really want to see that person feel bad. Somebody is a racist. I just want to get rid of them. I don't care if he feels bad or he doesn't feel bad. I dislike people of that sort. I may not want them killed. It might necessarily, depends on what the circumstances, how bad they are. But if somebody is, let's say a rapist, I want to get rid of rapists. I don't necessarily want to see them suffer. I just want to get rid of them. We're going to look into this in a few sessions from now when we look precisely at traumatized people traumatized from sexual experiences, where we're going to bring in a brief video from an expert in precisely this field. But right now, so he says, besides this, anger is accompanied by pain, remember? Whereas hatred, sometimes you don't feel pain. I know what he means there. I dislike people of a certain sort, but I'm affected differently at the time. Okay, I am going to make a pause here in the middle of hatred. It is now 10 before 11, and some people in our group need to go to continue another session in another room. Do you know which room it is?
No mini auditório do Centro Cultural do IEL vai ter agora, foi anunciado aqui, uma palestra da professora Elisabeth Rudinesco, né, de Paris. Então, essa palestra não vai ser dada aqui, e sim no mini auditório do Centro Cultural IEL, tá? Que fica aqui pertinho. Então, quem precisar ir, fique à vontade.
We have all loyal
Tá
people
bem?
here, so looks like we have all loyal crowds, so we're in business, so we'll continue. So look at the very last sentence. An angry person wants that the person with whom he is angry should suffer in return. But the hating person just wants him not to exist. Note that if you are angry, you want to cause pain to the offender and you want to see it. As Aristotle says, one wishes that the person with whom he is angry should suffer in return. When we hate another person, we just desire that they would maybe die or get rid of them, but then they wouldn't be suffering anymore. We're going to come back later to what Achilles thinks he's doing when he torments the dead body of Hector. Because it can't be revenge, because he's not making him suffer. Why he does it. So, one case that you might think of is Medea. We're going to come back to Medea later. But Medea, in getting revenge against her husband Jason, kills his children, but leaves him alive. We're going to look at other tragedies. Hecuba kills the person who has murdered her son. He kills the sons of the person who have murdered his son, but she leaves him alive and blind. So we will look at this distinction. So I'm suggesting that when Aristotle says perceived harm to the other. Perceived revenge, that's exactly what he means. He says, when I want revenge, I want to see it. I want to see the effects. I want to know that the other person has felt the same diminishment that I feel. And some of this, again, we're always going to be, not always, but largely anchoring our thoughts in Homer. This may be one of the reasons why Achilles is so upset that Agamemnon doesn't come in person. Because he can't see Agamemnon's pain and humiliation. And he wants to see it because that's what revenge is like. Now, there might be other reasons, and we'll go into them. Immediately after this, Aristotle discusses how anger may be appeased and how a person can be made unangry. How do I reconcile? You're angry at me. How do I get you less angry? Now, let's bear in mind, this is a treatise on rhetoric. Why do I need rhetoric? I am in a courtroom, or I am in the public assembly, and I am convincing people to feel one way or another. So sometimes I want them to be angry, and sometimes I want them not to be angry. So I need to know how to calm people down. And Aristotle is interested in how you do this. He says, we are mild, we are nice toward people who humble themselves in front of us, or who do not contradict us. Now, this is interesting, because why would I'm angry at someone, and the person says, oh no, you're absolutely right. I once had an experience like this. I had made a wrong turn in a car, and a person from another car came out furious with me. I opened down my window and she started screaming at me, and I said what I really believed. I said, you're absolutely right. I apologize. You are right. And she didn't know what to do for a moment. And then she calmed down. I mean, what else are you going to do? I admitted she was right. And she was right. I mean, it was absolutely right. It was my fault completely, and I shouldn't have done it. And it was an accident. I didn't do it on purpose, of course. And so she understood. And this calmed down her anger. I did not contradict. If I had defended myself, she would have been much, much more angry. So not arguing, not contradicting. But look what Aristotle says. Because when we don't contradict, they are seen to concede, to agree that they are our inferiors. And people who are inferior feel fear, and no one who feels fear offers a slight. Now, this is very packed, and I didn't go into it enough, but I'll just read a bit more. On the one hand, when I adopt, so let me put it another way. It's not just that I agreed with the woman. It's that by agreeing with her, I was confessing that I was inferior. I was less than she was. And so Aristotle says somewhere, he says, look, he says, I'll tell you about anger. Dogs do not bark at people who are sitting down. Only when they're standing up. Because when you sit down, you're showing yourself at the same level. So what I do by not contradicting is I show that I recognize your superiority. I've adopted a position of humility. And when I make my meekness, my humility manifest, it's my showing my inferiority. And that's why when we are always lenient with people, but I want to take this one point here and go a little bit more. Those who are inferior feel fear, and no one who feels fear offers a slight. So, what I did with that case study, that woman came screaming at me, and Aristotle says I was scared. At some level, I was scared. Now, that example isn't quite right, but let's say that I was in the right, and the person who came was wrong and came and screamed at me. And let's say the person who came and screamed at me was very, very big. And I'm not. And looked very, very angry. And I was in the right. But what I might do anyway is say that, no, you're right, I'm terribly sorry. I would humble myself. And by humbling myself, this guy who felt I had offended him by doing what I did, and therefore put him down, would realize, no, I didn't put him down, I'm putting myself down in front of him. And that's why Aristotle says, nobody who feels fear of someone can be angry. Because if I feel fear, I won't take revenge. And what is anger? Anger is a desire for revenge. That was what got me working on this whole topic. Aristotle said, anger, you cannot feel angry if you're afraid of someone. And I said, but that's crazy. That's just the kind of people I'm angry at. And instead of saying Aristotle's wrong, or maybe the Greeks are different, I said, what if Aristotle's definition of anger led to exactly this conclusion? In other words, let's not say the conclusion is wrong. Let's say what are the premises that would lead to this conclusion. To this day, I attribute my desire to turn it around that way to the fact that my undergraduate degree was in mathematics. That's how mathematicians think. Here's a hypothesis. What premises lead to it? And so I turned it around, and that's how I got to do this in the first place. Aristotle's way of thinking becomes clear when we look at it from his premises. Anger is a desire for revenge. If you cannot have revenge, you know you can't. It's out of the question. You don't feel angry. You feel disturbed, but it's not proper anger because it'd only be proper anger if you're going to try to get revenge. And with this guy looking in my window with, maybe he had a hammer in his hand, I'm not going to try to get revenge. I'm scared. And then what I'm going to do is make myself look small, and that's how I will appease him. This is the way Greeks do these things in that period. We're going to look at many other elements. Now, I am going to leave a good deal of my comments here to continue for next time because I want to leave time for discussion as well. But I'm going to go on a little bit longer. It's only 11 o'clock, and a drink of water will permit me to continue. Some of you have to leave at this hour, but you have the text in your hands. So you might think that, of course, anger plays a role in revenge. Who ever thought differently? Well, people do think differently. And anybody, and we're going to touch on this later, anybody who believes that retribution and revenge are the same thing, exactly the same thing, will have to believe that sometimes revenge doesn't involve anger, because I can take retribution without being angry. In other words, I can do what Seneca says. I can bring the person who murdered my father, I can bring him to the law, I can make sure he is punished, but I won't be angry. And I won't be angry because I'm doing my duty. I'm doing it to my father just as I would do it to any other human being. Anger is not good for us, and we want to get rid of it. A really wise person is above anger. They feel justice, but not anger. Seneca gives you, he could have picked all kinds of trivial examples. He could have said, well, I don't get angry when somebody pushes me in the theater, or I don't get angry when somebody steps on my toe. He says, I don't get angry when somebody murders my father and rapes my mother. He's taking serious examples because he really wants you to see how passionately he believes in this view. So in this same article that I was quoting, I keep quoting because it's a very good summary of everything, they write, anger plays an important role between people's appraisals of transgressions and their tendency to take revenge. What he means is when I see somebody did something wrong and I want to take revenge, anger plays an important role. Countless studies have now identified anger's correlational and causal roles in revenge. Well, this sounds good. In studies that simultaneously measure anger, fear, sadness, and frustration, anger emerged as the best emotional predictor of revenge. So, you know what that means? It means that I show how, of course, these studies, obviously they're not gauging my reaction in the car. They are putting me in a room with a video screen, and they are showing me stories, and they are trying to find out, correlate my description of my emotion with my desire to take revenge. And they're using questionnaires, and they may be using some biofeedback instruments. I mention all this because laboratory studies are not always reliable for understanding emotions. There are many cases. I'm going to stop and tell you one. I know I digress a lot, but because we won't be doing this later, Charles Darwin, the main source of our theory of evolution, the last book that was published while he was still alive was called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. Now, right there, you see that Darwin, unlike Aristotle, could see emotions in animals, like anger. Although he thought there were differences, too. And he played a special role on how the face looked. It was one of the very first studies, scientific studies, that used photographs in the published work. One of the very earliest. And they showed photographs of a man, there was many of them of the same man, whose face was distorted in various ways. And then people were asked to see whether that person looked angry, sad, happy, and so on. And Darwin sent photographs across the world to what he called primitive cultures, which would be like, give a more instinctive reaction, more like children's reactions. And he concluded that there were certain facial features that betrayed one single emotion and always. And Paul Ekman, who edited Darwin's book, re-edited it with a commentary, very important figure in the history of emotions, has argued that there are 5 or 6 basic human emotions, and they correspond to a single, universally identifiable expression. Two things. One, the pictures that Darwin published were, how do you take a picture of a guy who's angry? I guess I could get somebody in, well, I could probably do it with you. I could sit you down there and insult you until you look at it. That's the time to get the picture. But remember, in Darwin's time, photographs were new. And you had to sit still for a long time for a photograph to come through. You know what he did? He had a good friend, important friend, who worked in an insane asylum in France. And he had that person stick electric wires into the face to produce the muscle extensions. And when he published the pictures, he whited out the wires. This is a fact. This is a fact of how Darwin did it. And what happens is the following. If you try to correlate an expression with an emotion, and instead of using a still photograph, you use a video, the correlations drop to 0. What's more, if I give you a photograph, with a story, just a little caption. John saw his best friend for the first time. You will say that same expression is happiness 100% of the time instead of anger. 100% of the time. In other words, we have to be very careful with laboratory associations between certain types of emotion and certain kinds of expression. But in any case, these writers go on to say that, and I'm skipping a little bit down, there does not seem to be any single component of anger that drives revenge. Instead, several properties of anger, whatever they are, seem simultaneously to encourage vengeance. And they also say, that anger narrows your attention, and so it makes you focus just on the object of your anger, but then you don't pay attention to other things. But in any case, they conclude that anger is not the only motivation for revenge. Experiences of shame and humiliation can produce violent and vengeful tendencies. I am going, just one moment, I'm really conscious of the time because of my tendency to digress. And so I'm going to move quickly ahead, those of you who are responsible for this, it'll be a couple of pages, to a book by a man named Whitley Kaufman. The book is called Honor and Revenge, A Theory of Punishment. It came out just 10 years ago. And he argues, and I quote it there, retribution is in all significant respects, except procedurally, he means the law, equivalent to revenge. Indeed, it is remarkable that the illusion of a distinction between the two has persisted for so long, given that the aims and the method of both are identical, inflicting suffering on a wrongdoer in response to the wrong. Now, right away, we might say Seneca's conception of retribution is not looking to inflict suffering. Seneca is looking to fairness, to justice. It's not necessarily the case that I want somebody to suffer. When we get to our study a couple of weeks from now, to the way that people who have suffered severe damage from others, what they want through actual direct interviews, we'll see that rarely do they actually focus on suffering. What they do focus on, we'll see later. What Kaufman then does is give 6 traditional distinctions between revenge and retribution that he says none of them work. And I list them right here. Revenge is personal. Retribution is impersonal. So, if I want, Seneca might say that, I want to bring this man to court. But it's not a personal offense. It was revenge is. Revenge is excessive. Retribution is moderate and limited. In lecture number 7, I'm going to make the claim that the exact opposite is true. That the desire for justice leads to more horrors than the vengeful desire to get even and restore your honor. And you know why? Because you can restore your honor, but you can never know exactly what the limit is for retaliation when it is motivated by an abstract definition of retribution. So I'm going to turn the tables on this. And I must tell you, it's only come to me recently that I should do this. So we have to wait for lecture 7 before that becomes very obvious, but we'll get there. Revenge responds to any harms or insults, retribution only to moral wrongs. Well, maybe not. Revenge involves a desire to see the wrongdoer suffer. Retribution seeks justice. I think that's exactly correct. Revenge is based on a principle of collective responsibility, whereas retribution is an individual responsibility. What he means there is he's looking at feudal societies where generations later, somebody kills somebody, and I don't only get back at the individual, I get back at everybody in his clan. And finally, revenge assumes strict liability. Retribution requires moral responsibility. He takes on an essay by Robert Nozick, a very, very well-known philosopher, and argues against his various claims that, to the effect that vengeance is different from retribution. And I'm going to skip that entire discussion. Those of you who have, all of you, have access to my text, and you can look through the detailed account of Kaufman's arguments and why I think that they don't hold up. We can discuss those later, but given the time, let me skip quickly to not quite the conclusion, but maybe I'll get a little bit closer. One moment, give me just a moment. I'm skipping. Also, there's a section on forgiveness, but we're going to deal with forgiveness next week. In detail, we're going to ask whether or not forgiveness is a good response instead of revenge. Will it heal revenge? And we're going to look at reasons why it might, and also reasons why it might not. So we're going to take a critical perspective on forgiveness. So now I'm switching all the way out to page 20 in my summary here, where I said it's time to turn to the Homeric epics. Okay, I'm leaving all the philosophy aside for a moment. We can come back to that. So, as we noted 2 weeks ago, the first word of Homer's Iliad is anger. Or maybe it's something like wrath. Now, we know that what provokes Achilles' rage is, in the first part of the Iliad, is that he was dishonored. As he says to his mother, wide-ruling Agamemnon has dishonored me. Or Agamemnon has failed to honor the best of the Achaeans. And when Agamemnon sends that embassy to Achilles, offering to compensate Achilles with boundless gifts, Achilles' final words are, "My heart swells with anger when I recall those things, how Agamemnon treated me shamefully before the Achaeans," all the Greeks. This is extremely important, not just a personal thing aside. Right there, as if I were some vagabond without honor. And as I asked last time, and we will be asking more, what if he were a vagabond without honor? Well, then, Agamemnon would be fit to insult him. You see how the Greek thinking goes? Status is crucial. We are brought up with this liberal idea that every human being has equal dignity. This is not the way the Greeks thought about people. People of higher status didn't. Now, as we know, Achilles returns to battle after he learns that his dear friend Patroclus has been killed by Hector. He won't rest or take food until he has killed Hector. Why is he hostile to Hector? Now, there's a very fine study by a very fine scholar, Oliver Taplin. Some of you may even have encountered his name. And it's a study of the Iliad. And one section of the Iliad, of the book, is called Anger Displaces Anger. Now, what could we mean by that? Anger, I could understand if I meant pity displaces anger, or forgiveness displaces anger. What do you mean by anger displaces anger? He says, Achilles' anger after the death of Patroclus remains unchanged. It just is transferred to a new object. I was angry at Agamemnon. Now some more important cause of anger has arisen. I'm angry at Hector. So the poem is consistent. Taplin is aware that once Achilles learns of Patroclus' death, Achilles says, I wish that strife, meaning conflict, might be banished among gods and mortals, and also that anger, which Achilles says is far sweeter than dripping honey in the breasts of men. We love our anger. We want to dream of revenge. Anger is sweet, he says, and Aristotle quotes just this phrase. So he says, I wish there were no more anger in the world. But Taplin then says that Achilles is misleading here. I quote him, when Achilles turns his attention to Hector, he shows no awareness that what has happened is not that he has given up strife and kolos, anger, altogether, but that Hector has replaced Agamemnon as his target. Now, Hector has done Achilles, and all the Greeks, great harm. Achilles himself says that Hector did more damage to the Greek side than all the other Trojans put together. He has every motive for hating his opponent. But if anger is a response not to an injury but to an insult, and more particularly dishonor or belittlement, how has Hector provoked this emotion in Achilles? So this is the question. Yes, he seems angry at both, but if we use Aristotle, and when Aristotle discusses Homer, he only discusses this, the first part against Agamemnon, is Aristotle's view of anger applicable to Achilles' rage against Hector? Hector didn't insult him. Hector didn't diminish him. Well, was Aristotle wrong when he restricted anger so narrowly? In fact, there are very few references to anger at the end of the Iliad. As a matter of fact, there are a few, but there are enough. There are enough to say that something like anger is going on. And yet, there occurs, and now we're on page 22, if we're following here, there occurs a shift in the poem from anger, which was provoked by Agamemnon's arrogant behavior, to a desire for retaliation that responds to the pain that Hector has caused him. In fact, I am arguing that, I'm going to skip now another passage in which the little criticism of anger inside the context of the Iliad, and I conclude there is more than one source of anguish, hurt, in the Iliad. Achilles experiences both the resentment induced by an undeserved slight and the fury that is unleashed by the death of his dearest comrade, in the heat of which his earlier anger withers, it dissolves. There's no exact term in Homer for this sentiment. Sometimes a word for anger is used. That word kolos that I've got there, that's the same root as in melancholy. It comes from the word for the spleen. And melancholy just means black spleen. Melan meaning, in Greek, melas is Greek for black. So it's not exactly, what is it that, I'm arguing that Achilles was right when he said, I'm giving up anger. I'm reconciled with Agamemnon. Something did displace his anger. Something took over that was different from anger. It wasn't anger displacing anger. It was the extreme pain he felt when the dearest person to him was killed. Not murdered, not unjustly killed. This is war. People kill each other in war. When you're in war, you don't necessarily get angry at the fact that somebody has done something. You can even feel respect for your opponent in war. It just happens. Many soldiers on both sides of wars have felt respect for their opponent. In the same way that boxers can feel respect for one another, gladiators can feel respect for one another. You don't have to despise your opponent. You don't even have to hate your opponent. You're there to do your job. You're there to do the killing. So I'm suggesting that something else is going on. At the point at which Achilles says that in spite of the way Agamemnon angered him, he's now ready to repress the fury in his breath and go out and fight Hector. There is a marginal note in the manuscripts. Now, just let me say that, how do we read Homer? Now we read him in a book. Where'd the book come from? Before there was printing, everything was copied out. And you copy and copy and copy. But many of our manuscripts are not only copies, but they have notes in the margins. Have any of you ever seen an early book, printed book, like the one thing was printed in Italy very early, where the text is in the middle and there's marginal notes all around it. That's what many manuscripts look like. And those notes are called scholia. They came same root from the English school, escuela, the same root, because there were people who were scholars, same root again as scholia, who were writing these. And people copied not only the text, but they copied the notes. Where did they get the notes? Not from Homer himself, but from scholars who first put together the poems, probably going back to the scholars in Alexandria writing in the 3rd century BC. Scholars who knew Greek better than we ever will because it was their native language. And they were great scholars. And there's a note at just this point where Achilles says, I'm giving over my anger. And the note says, of the two emotions besetting Achilles' soul, one is anger and the other is grief or pain. One wins out, for the emotion involving Patroclus is strongest of all, and so it is necessary to abandon his wrath and avenge himself on his enemies. So something has displaced his anger. And what is it? Grief. So grief is driving his behavior now. And so I would say then, if Achilles' fury toward Agamemnon is motivated by anger, as this ancient critic says, but he's motivated by grief when it comes to the death of Patroclus, are there two motives for revenge? One is anger and one is grief. See, we're looking at the emotions behind it. Should I then have to expand Aristotle's definition that I offered before and say that, yes, anger aims at revenge, but there's more than one thing that aims at revenge? Maybe grief also? I wouldn't want to say grief always aims at revenge, would I? That doesn't sound right. Would grief always aim at revenge? Or is there something in Achilles' reaction to the death of Patroclus that might distinguish it from revenge? Now, we might begin by looking at the fact that revenge seeks to reclaim your honor. By humbling the offender, by making the offender bow down to you, we are to restore the relationship that existed before the insult occurred. Precisely because revenge is the action component of anger. I'm angry and what I want to do is get revenge. It's directed, it has a goal, and you can achieve the object of the goal. But killing Hector won't bring Patroclus back. It cannot assuage the pain that Achilles has experienced. That he continues to abuse Hector's body as though he were alive makes it obvious how futile his actions are. And what's more, we are told, and he knows, his mother told him, that after he kills Hector, he's going to die. So it's not even practical. He's going to lose in the end, and yet he does it. Is Achilles then doing something different? Is he doing what Seneca said? He's not motivated by anger, he's just righting a wrong. He's making things better without regard to the satisfaction that revenge promises. I get revenge because I want satisfaction. If I kill somebody who's killed my friend, I'm not getting any satisfaction because I'm not restoring the previous situation. Well, he's certainly not dispassionate the way Seneca wants him to be. Perhaps we may say that the loss of a dear person is a kind of diminishment. And our feelings toward the responsible person resemble anger. Maybe we could say that. Not every loss. And we're going to go, I forget if it's next time or the time, I think a couple of times after, we're going to look at the play Electra, where the question is going to be precisely what kind of loss inspires revenge. Is it any loss? Somebody dear to me dies in the hospital. I happen to have noticed, and we're just now at the very end of my comments, we'll open up for conversation, but I happen to have noticed in my family that when somebody dies, the conversation invariably takes account of mistakes that were made. Invariably. We'll go in, my uncle was 94. He'd been sick for a long time. The doctors didn't notice it in time. The chemicals or the medication that they prescribed were wrong. He shouldn't have been allowed to be in bed. He should have been picked up and taken around and walked. That would have helped him. If those of you who have experienced this kind of conversation, you probably noticed it. When there's every reason to believe that the person died, we want to feel anger. And we can't feel anger without ascribing blame. So we ascribe blame because grief feels like it wants to be anger. But it doesn't have to be. And we sometimes, usually when the immediate experience is over, we grieve at the loss without blaming anyone. We just feel the loss. It's painful, but it so easily mixes itself up with anger. That's the argument I'm making. So I would just say that maybe there are cases where anger and gets mixed in with other emotions, even though it's not the primary one. So I'm going to go with the ancient scholar, going back over 2,000 years, who said, no, Oliver, to Oliver Taplin. Oliver Taplin's a good friend of mine. No, Ollie, might call him. No, I'm sorry, it's not anger displacing anger. It is grief displacing anger, but it's the kind of grief that is looking to feel angry. And literature, I would go on to a very brief discussion of the Odyssey, but I'm not going to do that now. But what I conclude at the very, very end is with Odysseus at the very end of the Odyssey, as with Achilles, there seems to me to be a mixture of motives. Maybe retribution is commonly compounded, has an element of revenge in it, a function of the complex nature of human psychology. It's the function of literature to explore the rich nuances of human motivation, blurring the neat distinctions that philosophers and sociologists like to make, not to mention literary critics like myself. But those distinctions help us to unravel, to some extent, the skein, the tighted knot of motives that lie behind many of our actions. And I conclude that the two epics show the value of Aristotle's close association of anger and revenge, even as they reflect the tangled nature of human action and motivation. So thank you for today. And next week,
So I thank you very much, David, for this wonderful talk, for this immersion in the mind of the revenger, passing through epic, tragic texts of ancient Greece, and also through Aristotle and Seneca philosophy, until family, modern funerals, and traffic, and our traffic fights. In fact, a very good ambient to research on anger and revenge. You have pointed out, amongst many other aspects, the intersection between revenge and retribution. And let me here confess our extreme difficulty in translating retribution to Portuguese. I let it like that, Retribuição, but because it's very difficult. I was thinking of retribution for us has a very positive sense normally, né? So I thought about translating as revide, revidar, or as retaliar, but retaliar is also like maybe too negative for us. I don't know if you agree. But in fact, retaliar comes from lex of talio, né? Talis qualis, the dente por dente, olho por olho, as we say here in Portuguese. And about that, because of this subject, we have invited Eduardo Henrique Aubert, who is in our screen. In our screen, we have also Carol Martins da Rocha, professor of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, that you know already, and Carlos Renato de Jesus, Rosário de Jesus, who is professor at the Universidade do Estado de Manaus. They are also watching the course with the students. But Eduardo Henrique Aubert, who is the moderator today, I will speak in Portuguese because you already know. O Eduardo Henrique Aubert é professor de latim da USP, fez pós-doutorado com a gente em letras clássicas, deu um curso aqui, alguns de vocês participaram, um curso de pós-graduação sobre gramática do latim com teorias modernas. O Eduardo ele foi chamado porque ele tem uma tripla formação, acho que interessa a todo mundo. Ele é doutor em História, ele é formado e doutor em História, graduado e doutor em Letras Clássicas, graduado e doutor em Direito, né? Nesse sentido, trabalhou, pós-doutor também em História, enfim, não vou falar o currículo do Eduardo, mas eu quero falar mais das afinidades que teria com essa discussão que envolve literatura e direito e tantas outras áreas como história, né? I found it very, very interesting that you emphasize the function, the role of literature in, how can I say, depicting and reflecting on the extremely complex nuances that characterize revenge, retribution, and all those feelings involved. So I would like to open to the moderator first, because he's away, and then we open to the questions of the public, if you don't mind. And also we have questions at the YouTube that Mônica will transmit to us. Eduardo, você tem a palavra. Não sei se você está ouvindo.
Estou ouvindo. Bom, eu vou falar em inglês, mas se houver necessidade de traduzir alguma coisa, vocês fiquem à vontade. Eu não estou aí, infelizmente, mas acho que, Isabela, pela sua mediação, qualquer coisa a gente negocia. So I'll be very brief, but let me begin by thanking the Instituto de Estudos Avançados and especially Professor Isabela Cardoso for the invitation to be here today. It's a pity that I couldn't make it to Campinas, and I hope that before Professor David Konstan goes away, I might be able to come and see you in person. And of course, Professor, many thanks to you for a brilliant and extremely stimulating talk that certainly opens new ways of looking at very old materials, as you could say. In reading your text and hearing you talk today, I was stimulated by, of course, many points, but especially two, on which I would like to hear your comments, just as a way of teasing you to speak a little more about this fascinating topic. So the first is what seems to be the idea in Aristotle's definition of anger in chapter 2 of the second book of his Rhetoric. It seems to me to be a social emotion, and I don't know if you would agree with this characterization. I'm sorry, I think I'm hearing myself. Can you hear me? Okay, so I went back to the Aristotle's text and tried to look at the whole passage, and I was really stimulated by the end of the section when he said,
Alô, Edu, a gente não está ouvindo você. Você tem um microfone?
So I'll just go back to what I was saying. There are 2 points, Professor, on which I would like to hear your comments. The first is what seems to me to be an aspect of Aristotle's definition of revenge that I would think it might be appropriate to say that he defines anger as a social emotion. I don't know if you would agree with that. But I'm particularly interested in this textual problem that you mentioned, that David Ross appears to want to delete the first Phenomenes from Aristotle's text. And I sort of understood that he does that on the basis of Aristotle's definition of anger in his topics, where he talks about Phenomenon oligorian, but he does not say timorias Phenomenes. So he would see a kind of parallel that would lead him to delete the first Phenomenes from the rhetoric as well. But it seems to me to be very interesting, and that he should use these two, that he should use this word twice, so that in a sense it would be visible anger against visible lack of respect, what would be in question here. So it seems to me to be a very deep sense of the social placing of the emotion in this passage. And I would like to hear you talk more about that. And actually, going a little bit further in that direction, isn't timorias to be read as bearing its whole etymological meaning of that action that guards from horror or sees the time, the honor of someone? So isn't timoria a way of publicly guarding the honor that is owed to someone, and in this way it should be evident or phenomena to everyone? So this is the first point. The second point I would like to raise, and this is actually just to check that I understood correctly at the end of your talk, when you relate the discussion of anger with the Iliad. And now I'm thinking of the end of chapter 4 of book 2 of the Rhetoric, where Aristotle, as you mentioned, compares anger and hatred, or hate, against each other. And do I understand you correctly in seeing that your text might suggest that the emotion that Achilles feels towards Agamemnon is revenge? He wants him to bleed, so to speak. He wants the Achaeans to pay in Agamemnon's name for the slight on his honor, whereas his emotion towards Hector would probably be hate. And I seem to understand this from your text, but also from reading Aristotle. And I just 3 points about his comparison between these two emotions towards the end of chapter 4. First, when he says that hatred doesn't need, or it doesn't arise from a slight on yourself, on one's own. And truly, it seems that what Hector does in killing Patroclus is not a slight on Achilles' honor, much as it might be a cause of pain or whatever to him. The second point is that time changes anger, says Aristotle, but it doesn't change hatred. And it does seem that at a certain point, precisely in book 18, it seems that his revenge has dissipated, and time has in some way cured his desire to avenge Agamemnon. And of course, in the end of this passage, when Aristotle says that the one who feels anger wants someone to suffer, and the one who feels hatred wants this person not to be, as he says it, me einai, not to be. Well, that's exactly what he does, isn't it? He kills Hector, but he makes Agamemnon suffer until book 18. So do I understand you correctly? And do you think we could say that Achilles feels vengeful against Agamemnon, but he feels hateful, and he wants to kill Hector because of hatred? So these are the 2 points. I hope I've made myself understood, and I would just like to hear you more about these topics. Thank you very much again, Professor.
Thank you, Eduardo, very much. I agree with your first point, and I have doubts about the second one. So let me explain. The agreement is easier. I think that the emotions in Aristotle, let me start with the word pathos. Pathos is related to Pascha. It is the passion of Christ. What is the passion of Christ? Passion of Christ is not his emotions. Passion of Christ is his suffering. And the Greek verb pascho, from which we get these various different forms, passion itself is a Latin word, but it's the same idea. The terms here mean something that happens to you and causes a response. This is the emphasis is on the social interaction rather than on the internal feeling. Achilles doesn't say, I'm going to count to 10 and wait until the emotion goes away. Achilles says, I have been treated in a certain way and I must publicly compensate. And this role of the social public dimension of emotions runs throughout Aristotle and I think throughout Greek thought at this period. Now the second question is harder. I tend to understand hatred. Aristotle's discussion of hatred is very brief, and I think I may have quoted almost all of it to you. It's designed primarily to be contrast with anger, as we saw. But he says we hate classes of people. And so I looked up the uses of the word for hatred in Greek over a wide range of texts. The word I looked up, the word that Aristotle uses is, the noun is misos and the verb is miso. It's the word you have in misanthropist and in misogynist. A misogynist is a person who hates women. A misanthropist is a person who hates everyone, all human beings. And in Greek, it's a common thing. So what causes somebody to hate? Because, as Aristotle says, people are of a certain kind. And he doesn't say what kind. But I figured hatred is not so much the opposite of anger. Hatred is the opposite of friendship. Hatred is the opposite of love. So why do we love people? Aristotle gives several reasons in this same section. But the most important is that we love people because of their good qualities. Aristotle calls them virtues. So if I love someone, unlike a tendency today to say, well, I love them just because of chemistry, Greeks tended to say, well, why? You know, don't give me chemistry. I mean, that would be a primitive emotion. Yes, there is a certain instinctive emotion of love. It's the way mothers love their babies. That's instinctive. And the three categories that Aristotle gives for loving someone, they're either pleasurable, useful, or virtuous. Babies are none of them. If you ever had a small child crying until 5 o'clock in the morning, hatred is what you're more likely to feel. But the love, instinctive love, overrides them. However, with adults and people, we love for reasons. And the main reason is virtues. So if we don't like someone and hate someone, wouldn't it make sense to think the reason is their vices, their bad qualities? And that's exactly what we do. We hate thieves, Aristotle says, because they're bad people. We hate informers, people who go around telling the government you did something wrong. We hate them because they're nasty people. Aristotle, notice he doesn't bring in races. Later writers do. He doesn't say we hate the Persians. He doesn't say we hate the Trojans. Because we're not vicious. And there's nothing vicious about Hector. And Achilles doesn't think so. So I think that motive for feeling whatever he feels toward Hector is not the most likely one. He's not saying Hector is bad, hate Trojans. He doesn't really hate Trojans, and I don't think he hates Hector in Aristotelian or Greek terms. So there, I see the relevance, and since I'm allowing myself and ourselves to see mixtures of motives, that might not be one to dismiss entirely. It has elements of it, but I'm inclined more to stay with grief or pain. And I add one more comment here, just incidentally. It's interesting that grief is not an emotion that Aristotle discusses. Grief is psychological pain. Grief is what happens when someone hurts you, and it feels painful. And our reaction is not a moral emotion in the same way. So I'm inclined to think, to go with the Scholia, and think the better term here is psychological pain. And that can motivate real violence, but it's not anger, it's not revenge in the usual sense. So that's my pair of answers to the very, very good questions, Eduardo.
Thank you, Professor. It was a pleasure to hear you today.
Muito obrigada, Eduardo. Thank you very much, David, for the dialogue, for this inspiring dialogue. A gente está um pouquinho apertado com o tempo. Se tiver alguma pergunta urgente, a gente pode abrir. Se não, eu peço desculpas e a gente poderia... Urgente, assim, a gente teria uns 5 minutinhos para conversar ainda. Por causa do próximo compromisso ao meio-dia. Mas, se não for assim, save the idea, please. E aí, semana que vem, nós temos de novo, né? Temos a terceira conferência, que terá a moderação do professor Pedro Paulo Funari e do colega József Krupp, que é da Universidade de Budapeste. Mas, se tiver alguma pergunta que dê para responder rapidamente... Também, depois dessa minha fala, ninguém vai querer, né? É como se eu falasse, acabou. E os que perguntaram no YouTube também, a gente faz questão de, semana que vem, responder, passar para o professor antes e responder. Mas, enfim, algum comentário breve. Nós temos aqui, aproveito, então, para destacar a presença do professor Paulo Sérgio Vasconcelos, a professora do latim, a professora Patrícia Prata, o professor Flávio, da área de grego, o professor Cristian, evidentemente, né? Tivemos aqui outros professores da casa, da história, da sociologia, quem a gente também agradece a presença, e, sobretudo, aos que estão aqui, né, permaneceram nesse segundo encontro sobre as vingança, retribuição, que eu não sei como traduzir, e reconciliação na Antiguidade. If you don't mind, we could today stop now, and I promise that we will answer the question next week. So we'll have a homework task.
Thank you all, and let me just remind you, next time we'll both be talking about forgiveness, and after a slightly shorter talk on my part, we will be watching a 30-minute film on a very, very beautiful film on the forgiveness in the context of the genocide in Rwanda. Something which, though the experience itself has all the horrors, and we in America are accustomed to giving you trauma warnings, I think you will find this deeply, deeply moving and deeply beautiful, and not something that will be psychologically painful, but it's a strong picture, but it's a beautiful one, and so I invite you all to that next week.